BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays, I talk to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And in this episode, I will be looking at the book Better Dead Than Poor, Stories and Letters from Uncle D.B. Cooper by Lisa Story, re-examining Walter Reca as a D.B. Cooper suspect, and of course continuing with the Cooper Profile segment, which is all about the psychological profiling of skyjackers. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. Now, to regular listeners of Black Box Online Radio, you will know that I do other segments on this channel, such as one about Jack the Ripper every Wednesday, called Ripper Wednesday, and I've also been talking a lot about the JonBenet Ramsey case. Within the next month, I'm going to be launching a new segment about the Black Dahlia murder, the murder of Elizabeth Short from 1947, but of course there is Zodiac Monday. Every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer, and I would like to let you know that today's episode is partially sponsored by Michael Cole, a friend of the show and author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy. If the Zodiac case fascinates you, be sure to check out the Zodiac Revisited. It is a deep dive into the mystery with a unique and interesting perspective. The trilogy is available on Amazon, Spotify, and wherever you find your favorite true crime books. And if you enjoy the series, please consider helping out Michael by leaving a 5-star review. But I would like to get to the focus of today's episode, which will begin by talking about the book Better Dead Than Poor, Stories and Letters from Uncle D.B. Cooper by Lisa Story. And this is going to be a book that is looking at Walter Reca as a D.B. Cooper suspect. And I've said it once, and I'll say it again, I'm surprised at how many books. I'm surprised about how many books have been written about Walter Reca as a D.B. Cooper suspect. And when I do an episode about him here on Cooper Friday, I like to start from the beginning and tell the full story. I started this segment about 1.5 years ago, and Walter Reca was the second suspect that I looked at for Cooper Friday. And what I said in the past was, I have never gone into a true crime story with so much enthusiasm for looking at a suspect just to be let down, building up just to be let down, a giant bubble bursting. Because with Walter Reca, I looked at some of the original observations. Why do people think that Walter Reca was D.B. Cooper? First and foremost, he confessed to being D.B. Cooper, and it's so much larger than being a confession. He was willing to go on the record. He was willing to be recorded and provided a detailed confession as to how he committed the skyjacking. Secondarily, D.B. Cooper committed the skyjacking on November 24th of 1971, and that night Walter Reca was picked up by somebody named Jeff Osidich when he was in the woods of Clay Elum, Washington, wearing, I suppose, appropriate clothing for the skyjacking compared to D.B. Cooper's description. And Walter Reca seemed to have some type of raincoat draped over his arm. But then Jeff Osidich took him to a coffee shop, and they sat together for a while, it seems. What was Walter Reca doing in the woods that night? That is an equally big part of the mystery. But this book is going to begin with some stories of CooperCon, actually, and I'm going to be very clear. This is a prelude, this is an introduction, this is an introductory segment to this story here, and I often like to do that before I truly get immersed into everything associated with somebody's book, no matter which true crime case it is about. But she begins by telling some stories of CooperCon, actually, and interacting with other D.B. Cooper sleuths, interacting with other people who claim that they have solved the D.B. Cooper case, and also interacting with some of the people that I talk about regularly on Cooper Friday, such as Darren Schaefer, who hosts the Cooper Vortex, and someone who shall remain nameless. He is simply referred to as the mayor of Coopertown. Who on earth could that be? Hashtag sarcasm. But she does not seem to have had a very good experience with him, so I guess that's why she left out his name from the early sections, but we'll come back to the mayor later on. Anyway, there are these two major challenge questions that are explored in the early section of the book, and I would like to throw them out to you because you guys know that I cannot resist challenge questions. One of them is that if the FBI were to sign off on a suspect and it wasn't your man, how would you feel? And on Cooper Friday, the D.B. Cooper suspects that I've talked about the most favorably have definitely been Ted Braden and Skip Hall. I have standalone episodes about both of them here on BBOR. I invite you to follow some of the other Cooper Friday episodes. The suspects have also been assembled into a playlist. Now, if it turned out that it weren't DB Cooper was not Ted Braden or Skip Hall, would I feel bad? No, absolutely not. Why not? Because I would get to know the truth. And I should also point out that over the last 4 months, I've definitely thought more highly of Sheridan Peterson, especially after I realized that a lot of the things that were used to eliminate him might not have been reliable, particularly the DNA evidence, but I would absolutely put Sheridan Peterson as a lower suspect than Ted Braden and Skip Hall, if for any reason, because the chief proponent of that theory, Eric Eulis, no longer has Sheridan Peterson as his suspect because of not exactly contradictory evidence, but insufficient evidence, and also the major strikes against him. He had blue eyes, bright blue eyes, which was not reported by the witnesses, and to the credit of Drew Beeson, who's the author of Paratrooper of Fortune, he's also shared some photos with me about how Sheridan Peterson was actually a much larger, taller, and bulky individual than it appears in some of the close-up photographs, and that also doesn't seem to have been reported by the witnesses. So there are strikes against Sheridan Peterson, but with Ted Braden and Skip Hall, if it turned out that they were not D.B. Cooper, would I feel bad? No, absolutely not. But Lisa Story, author of Better Dead Than Poor, had a different type of response. In her book, she states openly that she would be angry if the FBI signed off on a different suspect. How would you feel, though? Like, to you, if you have a suspect that you strongly considered as to have been D.B. Cooper, and it turned out that all of your observations were incorrect, all of the reasons why you thought that he was Cooper turned out to be completely false, and the FBI says, hey, it turns out that it's this guy instead. How would you feel? That's the first challenge question. Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. And the second one that is mentioned here is, what would it take for you to admit that somebody was D.B. Cooper? And in this book, Better Dead Than Poor, Lisa Story says that people who were on this CooperCon panel were saying that, well, if you had a written confession, an audio confession, and if you were able to provide a $20 bill from the skyjacking, similar to the ones that were found at Tina Bar in 1980, if you're able to provide something like that, then yes, I would accept the evidence, I would accept the proof and say, all right, this person was D.B. Cooper. Now, individually, I would not accept those things at all. Say, for example, somebody like Walter Reca is going to go on tape, go on the record, and state that he was D.B. Cooper. 900 plus people have confessed to have been D.B. Cooper. They can't all have been Cooper. People will say things that are not true. Now, why would somebody confess to something that they didn't do? Why would somebody say something that isn't true? We're going to get to that in this episode here. Now, to the next point. What if somebody were able to provide a $20 bill from the skyjacking that was actually from D.B. Cooper's money? When he was on the plane, he demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes, and $6,000 has been found at Tina Bar, that was found in 1980. But what if somebody were to come forward and say, oh yeah, my uncle confessed that they were D.B. Cooper. Look, here's this $20 bill that he has provided to me, and if that serial number matches one that was logged, would that be sufficient proof? I would say no. As a standalone piece of evidence, absolutely not. You would have to know all of the reasons as to how this person obtained it, and I mean the truthful ones, not just because he says that he was D.B. Cooper. Did he get it from somebody else? Did somebody give him that? Did he find it at Tina Bar himself before the discovery was made in 1980? Hey, look, here's a shard of a $20 bill or something like that. So you would have to know the full context. Even if Joe Schmo comes forward and says that he has a $20 bill from the skyjacking, and it is indeed from the skyjacking, it does not mean that that person X is actually D.B. Cooper. You'd have to know everything about it. And I've really noticed that a lot of other true crime channels and even mainstream news outlets do not like to do that. They just take one fact that supports their agenda, and then they just run with it, and then they just explain all of these things and all of these reasons about how they have the answers to everything. But it all started with choosing one piece of evidence, and it's like their anchor point. And then they start finding other supporting reasons why they believe this thing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the person that they're looking at was actually the culprit. Now, if you go through this book, Better Dead Than Poor by Lisa Story, she tells more stories of CooperCon, and there's actually a very big discussion on a different D.B. Cooper suspect in this book, and his name is L.D. Cooper. And I've done a standalone episode about L.D. Cooper here on this channel, Lynn Doyle Cooper, and his niece Marla Cooper was picked up by the media about, 14 years ago. In 2011, there was a lot of buzz surrounding her when she confessed that she was the niece of D.B. Cooper, and that her uncle L.D. Cooper had confessed to her that he was D.B. Cooper, and a bunch of suspicious things that have come about. And she tells some stories here in the book about how they actually shared a car together going to a hotel. D.B. Cooper's two nieces were in a car together, as she said, but then during this car ride, Marla Cooper really began to change her tone of voice, and her personality almost changed. And she was saying that not only did she believe that L.D. Cooper was D.B. Cooper from 1971, that he also worked for the CIA, he worked for Operation Gladio in Europe, and Lisa Story was thinking, this really does sound a lot like my uncle, because Walter Reca would claim to have worked for the CIA. He claimed that he was a KGB agent as well. He had multiple fake passports and so on. Well, I say fake passports. He claimed that they were part of his CIA operations. So that is a very big 12-minute introduction to starting the book. Now to get to some more substantial things here that are associated with Walter Reca as a D.B. Cooper suspect. Another piece of evidence is that Walter Reca confessed to his niece that he was D.B. Cooper. But the biggest problem that absolutely everybody has with Walter Reca is that if he was indeed found in the woods on November 24th of 1971 in Clay Elm, Washington, that is 100 miles east of the flight path. How on earth could that possibly work? How on earth could any of that make sense? And the simple explanation that I will provide to try and give this story a shred of justice is that you'd have to accept that the flight path was wrong. And are the proponents of this Walter Reca theory the only ones who state that the flight path was wrong? No, absolutely not. The previously mentioned Eric Eulis also believes that the flight path was off. And it goes so far beyond that because, I was even reading in a different D.B. Cooper book about how some people think that the pilots intentionally went off course because they knew that Cooper was going to jump. He requested 4 parachutes for a reason, and they wanted Cooper to jump over rougher terrain, hoping that it would injure him. So, did they go off course by 100 miles, though? Well, the proponents of the Walter Reca theory would say yes. And then you would also have somebody who, really, just anybody who believes that D.B. Cooper landed at Tina Bar would also say that the flight path is wrong, that the pilots deviated from the flight path. To anybody who thinks that D.B. Cooper landed at Tina Bar and that he buried the money himself at Tina Bar that night, and there are multiple people who say that, they would also have to accept that the flight path was wrong. So, I'm really just trying to give some credit to this theory involving Walter Reca. I'd say that the other major point that people have against Walter Reca as a D.B. Cooper suspect is he does not match the physical appearances. None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. But that's just my take on the subject, and if you want to dispute that, you can put your ideas in the comments section down below. And also, I do want to be clear that there are multiple proponents of this theory, in addition to Lisa Story's book, Better Dead Than Poor, there's also the book Getting the Truth by Joe Koenig. There's The Search for D.B. Cooper. And then there's also D.B. Cooper and Me by Carl Lauren, which maybe is the most famous one. And I've said this once on Cooper Friday, but I'll say it again because I just like saying this part of the story. And that is that I think that this is one of my favorite book covers for any of the D.B. Cooper books that I've discussed. Most people go with Bill Rawlins's book, and they say that his book has the best book cover, and I disagree completely. I think that his is just a giant cluster fudge of imagery, and it's a pure personal preference statement. I don't know anything about Bill Rawlins. I've never met him personally or anything like that. It's just a preference. But with D.B. Cooper and Me by Carl Lauren, this book one has D.B. Cooper wearing the sunglasses, and you can see two people in one of the lenses. And at first you might be thinking, oh, well, he's talking about D.B. Cooper and his friend, so then that's a reflection, right? He's looking at them, right? But if he's looking at them and it's in the sunglass, why would there be two people in a reflection? So it's almost like this question, is it a reflection or is it a memory? I just happen to like that particular book cover. If you have one that's your favorite, you can put your idea in the comment section down below as well. And I would also love to know your response to the challenge question. What do you think about that statement? If somebody were able to provide a $20 bill from the skyjacking and they say that Mr. So-and-so confessed to them that they were D.B. Cooper, would you accept that story? I'm saying at face value, absolutely not. You would have to have more supporting evidence. It doesn't mean that they are lying, it's just you would need more evidence than just that by itself. Now, I want to use this episode to really talk about something different, because, as I've already told you, I've done more than one episode about Walter Reca in the past. So I'm going through Lisa Story's book, and she talks about Walter Reca's childhood growing up in Michigan. He was the child of a Polish and Russian family. He actually grew up trilingual in English, Russian, and Polish, and he learned English in his elementary school years, if I recall correctly, but there is something that is a little bit contradictory about that story, which I'll get to later on. But if Walter Reca is going to grow up to start telling these stories about being in the CIA, being in the KGB, and being D.B. Cooper, what could be a motivation for that? What could be a motivating factor for him to tell these stories? Well, in Lisa Story's book, she says very clearly that when Walter Reca was 6 years old, his father died in an event that has several different backstories to it. I mean, that's really the only way you can put it. I mean, the overall consensus is that his father died because he was electrocuted in a live wire incident, but an uncle tells the story that he went into the basement of a house and he was electrocuted because he was trying to plug in something related to the furnace and he was standing in a puddle of water. That's one variant of the story. There are two other variants that state that he was electrocuted not in the house but outside during a storm, and that's where the live wire incident took place. And then Lisa Story actually found an article from a Detroit newspaper that said that it wasn't any of those variants. It's that he was actually electrocuted while he was in a coal yard, not in the basement of the house or just outside with power lines on a storm or something like that. It was in a coal yard. So you can see that not everybody's in agreement with this. And she openly says it in the book. Memory is a funny thing. Memory is a weird thing. And not everyone remembers a story very clearly. And you would think that something like a family member's death would be something that people would remember very, very precisely. But that doesn't appear to be what happened. So for somebody like Walter Reca, is it possible that he grew up with just different stories about everything? Yes, of course, his father's death, but stories about everything? And that he could have just heard these things about how people are telling different variants of the same story. And I don't think that Walter Reca was a dumb guy, not at all. So he's like, all right, well, maybe the truth is a little bit more flexible than people think. Maybe the truth is a little bit more malleable than what people think. So then he can develop these types of wild stories because lots of people are saying things that aren't accurate. So why can't I do it? And does that not become the foundation for the Walter Reca that we know as a D.B. Cooper suspect, who just providing this detailed explanation about how he skyjacked the plane and ended up in the woods in Cle Elum, Washington? Is that not the foundation? He learned from an early age that many people aren't always completely accurate with their storytelling. Well, if they're doing it inaccurately on accident, why can't he do it inaccurately on purpose? Let me know what you think about that. Some other things that are shared in the book about Walter Reca's life is that when he was either 10 or 11 years old, again, people don't remember things precisely, he was involved with a rather large building fire where somebody had beaten up his sister. A man from the neighborhood had beaten up his sister. So Walter Reca climbed into the man's window, and it appears that he was living in a building with other people, but Walter Reca poured alcohol on the man's bed and set it on fire. Even at the age of 10 or 11, he would have known that alcohol was an accelerant that could have been used as to start fires. And I was just thinking, I was around that age when I first learned that, solely because of television, when people show that you can set things on fire using certain types of alcohol, and they actually never found out what happened to the man, whether he lived or died, but multiple fire trucks were called in, and it was a rather large blaze. But Walter Reca also talks about some of his criminal misdeeds in the book, or just his deviant behaviors, and according to Lisa's story and what she learned about Walter Reca growing up with him, that if his father had still been around, if his father had lived, he probably would have been able to control his son's behavior, or that Walter Reca would have stayed on the rails more. So it seemed like he did not get over the death of his father during his youth, which is totally understandable. It's totally normal and easy to accept. I mean, I can comprehend all of that. And I don't think that that's an outrageous statement. Now, it's no excuse for criminal misdeeds because, I mean, those things are illegal, but it's not beyond human comprehension. His father was a major part of his life. His father would have been a pillar of security. He died in an accident. Well, it's been determined to have been a freak accident. He was electrocuted to death when he was 6 years old. He never got over it. So as far as these actions and activities of Walter Reca, it seems like he maybe dealt with a lot of emotional dysfunction growing up, as well as a penchant for wild storytelling. And did that not turn into somebody who's ultimately going to confess to have been D.B. Cooper? Let me know what you think. And you heard very clearly about that story involving Marla Cooper and her D.B. Cooper suspect, L.D. Cooper, saying some very similar stuff. She's like accusing him of also being in the CIA and working with Operation Gladio. Always come back to Ross Richardson's appearance on the Cooper Vortex when he was interviewed by Darren Schaefer. Ross Richardson is the author of the book Still Missing. He has a D.B. Cooper suspect named Robert Richard Lepsey, and he said that what people like to do in the world of unsolved mysteries is they're shooting an arrow at the broadside of the barn, and then the arrow sticks into the wood of the barn. Then they start painting the target around it. That's what happens when you pre-choose a suspect. That's what happens when somebody has decided, all right, this person was D.B. Cooper, and then they find the supporting reasons that make it look like they were D.B. Cooper, shooting the arrow at the broadside of a barn and then painting the target. But what Ross Richardson also said is you can also add more and more circles to your target as long as you have space on the side of the barn. And then people are also going to be adding in different points such as, oh yeah, well, he was also in the CIA. Oh yeah, he also worked with this secret covert operation and so on. And it just turns into dopamine rewards in the brain. It just turns into stimulation. At first, the person thinks, I've actually made this very powerful discovery, or I actually know something about this high-profile true crime case that nobody else knows. So then what they do is they just add on different things because they want to experience that type of stimulation again and again and again. Oh, I learned this guy was D.B. Cooper. Oh, I learned this guy was a CIA asset. Oh, I learned that this guy was in the KGB. And it just goes on and on and on until, well, they run out of space on the barn. And also, if they are faced with contradictory evidence. So as you can see from this episode here, I've been talking about Walter Reca as a suspect, as well as looking at some challenge questions. And I also use this as an opportunity to talk about the thought process that would have gone into not only Walter Reca and his choices, but also to people who are pre-choosing suspects in any of the high-profile true crime cases that I talk about on BBO War, the Zodiac Killer, and Jack the Ripper as well. But I would just really like to know your feedback about everything that I have just said. As perhaps you can tell, I do not think that Walter Reca was D.B. Cooper for the following reason. I went into this with so much enthusiasm, like thinking there really could be something here, and then I felt such a big letdown as soon as I looked at the Walter Reca material, because to me, it seemed like this was somebody who was just taking us for a ride. I love D.B. Cooper metaphors because they always turn into bad jokes, but that's ultimately what it seems like happened with Walter Reca. Now, we have a couple comments that came in on my most recent Walter Reca episode, which was actually talking about a presentation that was done for the search for D.B. Cooper. But this one was firstly from Jay Weiss, who said that it would have been a more convincing story if Walter Reca had tried to pass himself off as an accomplice to D.B. Cooper, and that he's doing something involving with meeting up with D.B. Cooper on the night of the skyjacking, and that's why he's 100 miles east of the flight path. And I completely follow that train of thought. I follow that logic that Jay Weiss is saying, because also that you could also explain why Walter Reca doesn't match the descriptions. And as Ryan Burns likes to point out very clearly, Walter Reca claimed that he originally wanted to jump out the side door, which would have been horribly, horribly problematic with plane engines and so on. D.B. Cooper chose his plane for a very specific reason. Almost everybody in the Vortex states that D.B. Cooper wanted to jump from a Boeing 727 because he knew that it had a back-aft staircase, so he could jump without any complications with the wings and the plane engines and any type of damage to that effect. Like, he wouldn't be sucked into an engine, and he also wouldn't experience anything, interference from the wings and so on. He could jump from the back-aft staircase. Alright, so I also follow that. But if Walter Reca were just saying, oh yeah, I was the accomplice, I was supposed to meet up with him and get the money that night. And this will actually bring us to our next question that came from Dave Smith when he says, what is the explanation for Walter Reca using the money? And that is discussed in the book Better Dead Than Poor by Lisa Story, and she states that he would have bought a house with it because another supporting point for Walter Reca being D.B. Cooper, is that prior to the skyjacking in 1971, even though he has CIA connections, he was still living in a trailer. After the skyjacking, he was able to make the down payment on the house and purchase a house. So he would have used it to buy a house. That is something that's just included in the book. But right now I would like to get to the segment on the skyjacker, the Cooper profile. This is a segment where I've been slowly going through the book The Skyjacker by Dr. David G. Hubbard, and it's something that I use to conclude these D.B. Cooper Friday episodes. The Skyjacker is a book that looks at various cases of skyjacking because this was something that really took off in the mid-20th century. And as a psychiatrist, Dr. David G. Hubbard wanted to see if he could really try and find out the psychological elements that were driving people, like D.B. Cooper, to commit skyjackings. And there's a chapter that tells the story of Sam. All of the suspects and all of the patients and all of the people who are used in the case studies are only referred to by their first name. And to those of you who have been following the Cooper Profile segment here on Cooper Friday will remember that I frequently state that the majority of skyjackers had an alcoholic father who was abusive and also a mother who was very religious. With the story of Sam in the most recent chapter that I explored from the Skyjacker, he had a very different type of upbringing. Firstly, he had both parents that were religious, and when he was interviewed after his capture, he described his parents as religious, both his mother and his father. The first word that he used to describe both of them was religious, and his father did not appear to be overly abusive, so that's a different type a factor that's going on. And furthermore, many skyjackers report that in addition to being religious, their mothers are also extremely strict. Sam also didn't seem to have a very strict mother or a strict father. His father was the disciplinarian in the family, but he wasn't extremely strict. Instead, it seemed like Sam actually had very easygoing parents, even though they were very devout in their faith. They had rules that were very loose and they were very light, and just they weren't extremely harsh to him as a child. Sam was also somebody who was reasonably attractive growing up, to the point where he could attract other women to do things with him, and he wouldn't even initiate this. Older women were involved with his first experiences in a sexual way without even pursuing them. Sam was also a very athletic individual, so you can perhaps see why. He was somebody who was a letterman in football, but he really excelled at basketball, receiving an athletic scholarship to play basketball at a junior college. But aside from those early experiences with women where they pursued him, in the book The Skyjacker, it states that he really didn't do a lot of dating in high school, but then it also states that he met his wife when he was 17 years old. So I'm like, what? Big deal. Can't really feel bad for somebody like that. All right, he gets into his first real relationship when he's 17, and he just waited a little bit longer. And he also had experiences with women leading up to that, but it seems like he's much more focused on teenage activities that are not dating related and sports. Yes, he meets his wife when he is 17 and she is 14, and then they end up spending years together married. Now, Sam is very different than a lot of the other people that have been discussed in Dr. David G. Hubbard's book, because after getting married as a late teen, he goes into the Air National Guard. All right, now we have something aviation related, whereas a lot of these guys, maybe they had something in their life like that would drive them to this, but not so straight up like this. Aviation related. And then he gets out of the Air National Guard, he gets a job, he actually commits his skyjacking when he's around 36 years old. So he's married to his wife for over a decade. Almost a decade and a half. And, things aren't going too well. They have multiple children. When his son is 13 years old, he accidentally discharges a shotgun in the family home, and Sam is just absolutely furious. And by his own admission, he said things to his son that he shouldn't have. And I'm just sitting back reading this book and thinking, now, okay, I'm sure something bad really happened, but if somebody accidentally discharges a shotgun in a house, not everybody's going to take kindly to that. Not everybody is going to act like that's just an acceptable thing to do if somebody accidentally fires a shotgun. Of course, Paul Sini got away with that when he was hijacking his plane, and the flight attendant Mary Dohe was just like, you didn't mean to do that, did you? Not everyone is going to give that type of response, especially when it's done at home. And this really begins to affect Sam on an emotional level. He goes to his place of employment, which is a warehouse/family business, and he's just sitting there brooding. Oh, he's just getting lost in his angry train of thought. And that's when he decides that he is going to commit the skyjacking. But another big reason why Sam wants to commit the skyjacking is because of civilian aviation and civilian parachuting. After he gets out of the Air National Guard, he spends years practicing and learning about skydiving. He is a skydiver. He does civilian parachute jumping. That's what it's referred to as in the book. And I'm just thinking, yeah, this is the type of guy that's going to skyjack a plane. And Sam even once broke his ankle on a rough landing after he did one of these civilian skydiving attempts. I should just call it skydiving. Civilian para-jumping events. No, he broke his ankle skydiving. He put a cast on it. And once he was well enough to jump again, he jumped with the cast on. He went skydiving with a cast on his broken ankle. He just was very passionate about skydiving to the point where it was concerning to his family. They're like, whoa, maybe you're doing a little bit too much. So Sam's 36 years old. He's having some rough times with his family. And he really is not experiencing a very large amount of financial hardship, which will come up later. But then Sam decides that he's going to go to Cuba and kill Fidel Castro. Did I really say that? Did I really say it just like that? Well, that's how I encountered it in the book, The Skyjacker. This guy's thinking, you know what? I'm going to kill Fidel Castro. The CIA's trying to do it. I'm going to do it too. Almost just tying it right into this Walter Reca thing. Stories are malleable, but this is a very big difference where somebody's not just saying that they worked with the CIA. They're like, I'm going to do things for the CIA, but do it on my own terms. I'm just going to kind of go rogue and do it on my own. The CIA's doing it, why can't I? So he hijacks a plane that's going to Miami. He has a gun, and quite similarly to D.B. Cooper, he orders a drink on the plane which the flight attendant provides to him. Sam is carrying a .45, but while he's drinking his drink, it's just referred to as a drink in the book, he hands the gun to the flight attendant, who keeps it for him until he's done, and then gives the gun back to him. And I'm like, what? How? I mean, what? This person gave the gun back to him, but Sam doesn't hurt anybody, and he states that he wished he had a parachute so he could have jumped sooner, but the plane ultimately lands in Cuba. He's arrested. He spends time in Cuban jail. He's actually sent to Canada, where he is incarcerated again, from Cuba to Canada and then to the United States. But a big difference between Sam's story and all of the other stories in The Skyjacker is he had the funds for his own legal defense. This guy had the money. And it really goes to show that these things are not cookie cutters. You can't just say that every single skyjacker is going to fit the mold exactly. This is a guy who did not really have abusive parents. This guy was someone who was not completely poor. Better dead than poor, right? No, this guy was someone who had enough money, so he didn't really need to do that. He just seemed like he had some type of obsession about aviation, and he was also trying to commit the skyjacking because perhaps for exhilaration, perhaps he was frustrated with his life. This was almost a pre-midlife crisis, so to speak. But there are some other details, though, that are a little bit different from Sam compared to the other skyjackers from a psychological perspective. And one is that he almost never remembered his dreams. And Dr. David G. Hubbard loves to talk about the interpretation of dreams. Sam really only had one dream that he remembered very clearly, and that was that the devil was trying to chase him around and he couldn't get away from the devil. And I'm really not the biggest person on the interpretation of dreams. I don't know what you guys think about them, but I have been dissuaded, I guess, and I really just wanted to lay everything out there because I fully accept that this is Dr. David G. Hubbard's research. He thought that it was important. He wanted to make observations about how do skyjackers dream. And, if you go through his book, The Skyjacker, you'll read about how some people, have dreams when they are flying and some when they're falling. And skyjackers almost never dream about flying. It's an interesting commonality all the same. But the reasons why I was dissuaded from interpreting dreams was we used to go to places like Barnes & Noble and Borders when that bookstore was still around, and they had all of these books about dream dictionaries and dream journals. And when you look at like a dream dictionary and it tells you that if you were to have a dream about this, then this is what it could mean. But not all of the books said the same things. A lot of them said very contradictory things. I also had a teacher when I was 17 years old who told us dreams are meaningless. There is no scientific consensus on the interpretation of dreams. Like, if you have a dream about a horse, it doesn't mean this for every person. If you have a dream about swimming in the ocean, it doesn't mean this. And also, as I entered into my early 20s, I encountered these statements from people when they're saying that, if anything, dreams are distractions, where they're trying to distract your brain so that your body can go to sleep. And I've also found that the most vivid dreams that I have occur when, let's say, you wake up 1 hour or 2 hours before the alarm clock goes off and you try to close your eyes again, and then you have the most vivid dream in the world that's on par with real life, except it's extremely ridiculous. And then when you wake up, you realize there's no possible way that that could have been true. But yes, that happens about 1 hour or 2 hours before the alarm clock goes off. So that's one thing, though, where I began to experience just this type of shift toward believing that dreams are more or less distractions. But Dr. David G. Hubbard seems to think very highly of them, and it's an interesting commonality that overwhelming majority of patients in his case studies did not have dreams when they were flying. So it's almost as if there is this type of euphoria that is lacking from their lives, and they wanted to try and create it in the external world by committing the skyjacking, so to speak. Then ultimately, the bigger and perhaps even more important issue with the skyjacker in this episode is a commonality that is present in Sam's behavior. In fact, maybe one of the only commonalities that he has with almost every other skyjacker that I've talked about on Cooper Friday is he had a stronger relationship with his mother than his father. I'll say that again. He had a stronger relationship with his mother than his father, because that's what seems like happens with almost every case that I've talked about on the Cooper profile. It's as if the father is present, maybe even involved, but the father is the harsh one, and the mother is also harsh, but the son takes a liking to her and follows in her religious footsteps. With the case of Sam, both of his parents are religious and they're not overly harsh, but he still bonded with his mother more than his father. And at the end of the year, I'm going to take all of these observations and create my own psychological profile about D.B. Cooper. But this type of motherly bond is definitely going to play a very, very critical role in looking at these actions and activities. And with somebody like Walter Reca, you can see this very clearly about how he was someone who got pulled in to an unfortunate situation where he lost his father at an early age. So by default, he ended up bonding with his mother. His mother actually remarries to a man named Chuck, who is actually not so bad. Walter Reca even says that he liked him, but by the time his stepfather came into his life, even though he would have been a good father figure, it was too late, and he was already a deviant. So with Walter Reca, it's a little bit different than a lot of these other case studies that I've talked about. But at the end of the day, I don't think that Walter Reca was D.B. Cooper. Instead, I think he was a wild storyteller who realized from a young age that the truth was somewhat malleable. I would love to know your responses. You can put them in the comments section down below. Please share anything that you think about Walter Reca, D.B. Cooper, and the psychological profiling of skyjackers. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and there is also the Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, which I'm using more, and of course there is blackboxonlineradio on Instagram. This show is no longer on TikTok. Black Box Online Radio got banned from TikTok, unfortunately, so on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, I release shorts Monday through Friday that are mostly talking about serial killers, true crime news, and any subject under the sun or in the darkness. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And there is a link for that in the description box, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. I would like to thank everybody who left questions and comments that have been used for this episode. I would also like to thank everyone who's been following along with the Cooper profile and the entirety of the Cooper Friday segment. And until next time.